From your world news headquarters on the World Wide Web, it's time for your daily dose of sanity. This is the Meria Heller Show. Meria Heller is a published author, founder of the Universal Wheel, a lifestyle and philosophy based on our interconnectedness to all living things, a Reiki master, and delivers the news with spiritual views. How many intuitive news decoders, animal rights activists, and vegetarian broadcasters are there? Just one, Meria. Meria has provided independent news for a smart audience for over 13 years now on the Meria Heller Show, available at meria.net.
Meria.net.
And now, here is your host, the mouth that roars, Meria Heller.
Good morning, world. Meria here, alive and kicking. Welcome to the show. Today I have a special guest on the show. I can't believe it's probably been at least 12 years since he's been back on the show. My bad. Oh, an expression I truly hate. And he's the one and only Danny Schechter, news dissector. And what a byline for Danny. He's an American journalist. He's a documentary filmmaker. He's made 6 nonfiction films with Nelson Mandela. And he was also asked personally by the filmmakers of Long Walk to Freedom to make a 3-hour TV documentary about the making of the film. He's worked in South Africa since the 60s, which has given him unprecedented access to insiders. He wrote about the liberation struggle. He produced a TV news magazine for 3 years. He's worked in public TV, CNN, ABC News. He's also been part of the anti-apartheid movement globally as an activist, which has earned him the confidence of many anti-apartheid leaders. He's also a fellow New Yorker, so I'm really happy to have him with me. Today we're going to be talking about his latest book, Madiba, A to Z, The Many Faces of Nelson Mandela. And Danny, good morning, and I hope I said that word right.
Not only that, but now you're an honorary member of the Xhosa tribe for having pronounced that properly. That's Nelson Mandela's tribal clan name that everybody in South Africa knew him by. So, you know, in the same way that there were people in Indonesia with one name, you know, Sukarno, Suharto, Madiba is the name that people know Mandela by in South Africa and increasingly around the world. So that's why I used it for this book, which came out of these documentaries I've been making in South Africa on the making and the meaning of the Long Walk to Freedom. That's coming out in March. But while I was there, I interviewed about 150 people who are I had spoken to before, but I was looking for new information. What don't we know about Nelson Mandela? And they were very happy to accommodate me and to share their ideas with me. We transcribed that, and that became one of the bases of this book, Madiba, A to Z, The Many Faces of Nelson Mandela. And, you know, the idea of it is that when people say the name Mandela, you know, they have like one image in mind. You know, he freed South Africa. He you know, was nice to the whites. He, you know, was a good negotiator, you know, whatever it might be. But they think of him in terms of one thing, one achievement. And what I'm doing here by using a kind of an alphabetic format, you know, A to Z, A to Z, as they say here, you know, is to say, no, this was a person who had many different faces and interests and things that he did well and some things he didn't do well. And, you know, A is athlete, okay? B is bully. C is comrade. D is diplomat. So all of these are to introduce Mandela through a storytelling technique, you know, that is probably more appropriate to the age we live in, the Twitter age, where, you know, you get information in 140-character chunks. Right. And so what I wanted to do is do this in stories you could read, you could put down, you don't have to read from beginning to end. And the response I've been getting has been very positive about that. They find it much more intriguing and interesting to hear not only what his closest people, friends, and comrades said about him, but to get some more insight into his personality and style. You know, he's been covered a lot in the news, but as you told me before we began, you know, nobody knows anything about him. So isn't that weird? Okay.
Right. I mean,
incidentally, you'll be particularly happy to know that when he came to America in June 1990, the first place he went, Brooklyn, New York. Okay? He went to what was then Boys and Girls High, had been Boys High, is now Nelson Mandela High. So, he went to Brooklyn first, and he got a great reception there in the streets from so many people, showing the love that Americans had for him and support for him, after 27 and a half years in prison.
Right. Well, that's interesting because, having grown up in Brooklyn, there certainly was apartheid happening in Brooklyn when I was a kid. By the time I got to high school, it seemed to start leveling out, in the late 60s after after all the civil rights movements and riots. I mean, we had riots by the thousands in Brooklyn. But it's interesting that would be his first stop. I will tell you this, the way you wrote this book is excellent because I, like a lot of other people, really didn't know as much about Nelson Mandela as I thought I did. And after reading the book, you really get a picture of the whole man. And he wasn't a saint, never claimed to be a saint, never wanted to be a hero. He was just in a class by himself. I mean, who even knew he was a boxer?
Well, this is what, I discovered. But not only that he was a boxer, okay, he's a tall guy, very good-looking guy, very strong man. And he began to box. He wanted actually to be the heavyweight champion of the world. That was one of his early aspirations. However, the actual discipline of training for boxing is part of what enabled him to survive prison all those years later. He was very careful about what he ate. He was very careful about his sleep, his exercise regimen. He drove many of the other prisoners crazy by pushing them to exercise more, to get physical, not just to sit around and either be morose or angry, but to actually bring other aspects of their life. He became a gardener, okay, because in touching the soil, he felt like this was a piece of the earth that he could have some impact on. While in prison, he was denied, impact on the people who looked up to him. So, this is somebody whose methodology, whose way of being, whose way of reaching out to people is something that has lessons for all of us. One of the things he was somebody who listened and learned. He didn't sit on his principles and inflexibly, but he was open, even to talking with his enemies and learning from them, learning their language and all the rest of it. Speaking of Brooklyn, just on Sunday, I went to the Brooklyn Tabernacle Church, which is like a massive 5,000 people worshiping on a Sunday, great gospel music and the like in downtown Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And the sermon there was, you can be soft to be hard. It was basically saying that you gain more by being open-minded and willing to talk to your enemies and get their respect and going, as the guy said, all Brooklyn on them, and battling with them. So a lot of what he accomplished seems remarkable because when he got out of prison, most of the people in the world expected a bloody civil war, with thousands and thousands of deaths. And he managed to avoid that by bringing others into the process, getting them a stake in creating a new South Africa. And I think in that respect, he had a lot of intuitive insight. And part of that, believe it or not, came from his tribal background because he grew up in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, in the Xhosa tribe, and he where governance was done by consensus. In other words, it wasn't like one guy bossing everybody around. It was people listening and deciding by consensus about which way to go. And that was, it's a very democratic way of proceeding as well. And I think that really influenced him. And that's what I go into, stories like this and Madiba A to Z, the many faces of Nelson Mandela.
Right. So let me ask you this, because you did work on 9 documentary films about Mandela. I'm assuming at different times you had a closeness or relationship with him. What was he?
I mean, I had access, maybe unusual access. I remember when he came to New York, and we were at the top of the Rockefeller Center, Radio City. What is it called there? The Rainbow Room. Okay, and there was a breakfast given to him by none other than David Rockefeller. It was all the high and mighty bigwigs of New York there, and they were waiting for him to come. I had my crew. We set up, towards the, middle of the room, and he walked in with his security entourage. And somehow in this whole sea of people, he spotted me, okay? Mm-hmm. And he walked right across the room to me. And I said, where's he going? What's he doing? He comes over to me and he says, remember me? I mean, he had a great sense of humor and, personalizing relationships. I was one of, thousands of journalists who met him in the course of a career that went back, he died at age 95. His movement was 100 years old. I mean, but nevertheless, he made people who met him feel special. Meeting him was like sometimes one of the great moments of their life. Mm-hmm. And he realized that. And so in a way, he played a role that his values contradicted. The role was, kind of this magnanimous, leader, godlike figure, okay, who saved South Africa. He knew that wasn't true, that it was a social movement that made the changes from the bottom up, mm-hmm. That he believed in collective, decision-making, not individual decision-making. At the same time, he realized people needed a leader. They needed somebody they could believe in, not just a bunch of slogans. And as a consequence, because people respected him so much for his sacrifice, for being in prison, for standing up, for fighting back, for resorting to an armed struggle when that was called for, and bravely, being willing to die for his beliefs, all of that led to him almost having a Superman kind of status in South Africa, which he himself, when he was with someone, would, laugh at, would scorn, mm-hmm. I'm not a saint, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But people seem to need that. They needed a Mandela. They need leadership in the same way that people flocked to Obama, believing somehow, because maybe he was black, because he was saying some of the right things, he was going to be this very progressive president. And in the end, he turned out and is turning out to be a disappointment to many, right, because he hasn't been able to achieve some of his goals. And part of that is because of, pressures that we don't see on the inside, but part of it is his lack of, real leadership and strong values, his willingness to compromise and in a bad way. Right. Okay. So, these are part of the dynamics of politics. As you know, politics is often personality politics, and a lot of the money given to politics is to buy ads that reinforce those personalities, Mm-hmm. So, Mandela realized that. He was very smart, he was a lawyer by training, a litigator in practice. He had, so he had skills, an ability to navigate through a system. He wasn't totally an outsider, even though his movement went up against, a terribly both corrupt and vicious racist system. And he was able to overcome that, in part because of those values that he had, the skills that he had, and his willingness to work with others, to actually consult with people who he even disagreed with. Mm-hmm. And I think that is another one of his lessons that I go into in Madiba A to Z.
Right. Well, one of the things that I really liked was, and I think you were quoting another author, I think you were quoting Mandela's authorized biography, where it said that he had a philosopher's detachment. And when I read those two words, that means he was really in balance. It seemed like he could get really hot about something, but still keep his cool.
True, and also true is that he had a kind of a long-term view, okay? If he had a short-term view, he could have burned out very easily. He realized that he had to wait them out. He was in prison for all those years. And as a consequence, he wasn't in a hurry because he couldn't be in a hurry, okay? Mm-hmm. And so he helped bring about his own release from prison, which is one of the amazing stories of negotiating with his jailers, basically, and convincing them that it was in their interest to release him and his comrades, which they did, which set up the scenario of negotiations that led to the first democratic election in the country. So that was his genius in a way, but at the same time, if he didn't have this movement that he was part of, mm-hmm. I don't think he could have achieved any of this. In other words, he was not elected really to do any of this. He did this as a leader who was widely respected by the people he was serving, and he had a notion of service, serving them,
right.
which was something I think that was very conscious.
Mm. Well, I'm sure you've been asked this question before, Danny. What's a nice Jewish boy like you caring about apartheid in Africa?
It's an interesting, my backstory, as we call it in the movie business. Is that I went to high school in the boogie down Bronx, DeWitt Clinton High School, and I had some pretty good teachers, and we read some stories about Cry the Beloved Country, a famous book at the time. I was reading Life magazine. I was reading the New York Times, as a teenager. And I learned about South Africa, and it was quite fascinating to me because I had become involved in the civil rights movement in America, and it was about racism and segregation. And being concerned about apartheid was kind of an extension of that. So, Life magazine featured all these big stories about oppression in South Africa. So I began following it, learning about it, getting to know it. It was quite interesting. When I went to college at Cornell University, I edited a magazine, and one of the issues we had debated in that magazine was apartheid in South Africa. In 1964, I was part of the SDS, and we had a sit-in at the Chase Manhattan Bank in Lower Manhattan, which was financing apartheid. So I saw that as part of kind of my political orientation, to fight against injustice, to fight for human rights. In 1966, I went to the London School of Economics for graduate school. Graduated from Cornell, went to the London School of Economics, and there I met a bunch of South Africans in exile, people who had been active in this struggle and then, were forced to leave the country one step ahead of their, possible jailers. And, these people were very serious about revolution, very serious about overthrowing apartheid. Took them a long time. I mean, this was 66. Apartheid didn't fall until, 1994. So it took a while, okay?
Right.
But in 1967, I was recruited. People came up to me and said, look, you got a big mouth. You're, active in the school politics. You're against the war in Vietnam. You're speaking out on all these issues. What about helping us in South Africa? And I said, well, how can I help you? I mean, what can I do? They said, well, we have a problem because we can't get our people into the country because the security police knows, they have all of our membership lists. They know all of our supporters, and they've been picking them off and rounding them up. And we need to send in people with other passports into South Africa to engage in various missions secretly. And so I was one of the people that was recruited. It's called the London Recruits, and there's a book out called London Recruits in which I tell my story of how I went to South Africa underground in 1967, and in the course of it, learned a tremendous amount about the country and about what was going on there. I mean, it was a very scary time. Mandela was already in jail. The apartheid repression, the police state, it was a state of emergency. It really gave you an upfront personal look at what was happening there, and that really inspired me to get more involved with this issue, because the reason I thought it was an important issue because here we are in America struggling for civil rights, and here's the American government, which claims to be making progress on civil rights, supporting the white South African apartheid regime. American companies invested there, American, arms being sold there, et cetera, and so forth. That the United States was then fighting a war in Vietnam, but it was preparing for war all over the world, which it still is. And in South Africa, it was involved in supporting a very unjust system. And so I recognized that I needed a global outlook, that it wasn't enough just to talk about partisan Republican versus Democrat politics, which is what so many of us, talk about.
Right.
But to look at the system of what I saw as imperialism, as a global system of American domination around the world. I learned about that in London, and I came back to America, and I became a journalist. I worked for a magazine called Ramparts, which was an investigative journalism magazine. And then, in 1970, I went on the radio in Boston, WBCN, which is the big rock station, and I became known as Danny Schechter, the news dissector, and I began covering the news from around the world, including South Africa. So I was, very internationally oriented, partly because I, went to school outside the United States, which is always a good thing to do, so you get a little perspective outside the bubble, and, and became very engaged in this, and that led to being involved with the Sun City Project with Bruce Springsteen and Stephen Van Zandt and old Bono and all these artists. It was a big album against apartheid in 1985. And then I set up a television series called South Africa Now, which was on public television, which went for 3 years, 156 programs, to try to challenge censorship of the South African story in South Africa and here. I had worked for ABC News for 8 years, so I'd been sort of an outsider turned insider turned outsider, and I felt like this South Africa story was particularly a vital way of showing how we're not getting the truth on television. Okay,
right.
That is what became my concern, and then I started writing books about the media. The more you watch, the less you know. News Dissector and others. So that's my trajectory politically, but South Africa has been at the center of a lot of my passions because it was such an obvious case of a majority being suppressed. We compared it to the civil rights movement, where a minority was struggling to get their rights under our Constitution. But in South Africa, there was no Constitution. And the majority, was being oppressed by a minority. It was very different, actually. So I felt like this needed to be explained, and I tried to do it as a journalist on television, on radio, and now in film, and with documentaries of various kinds. And all of those were great learning curves for myself. I mean, it was a fascinating experience, and to be welcomed by Nelson Mandela and be able to actually travel with him and the rest of it was quite dramatic, for a boy from the Bronx.
Right. A nice little Jewish boy from the Bronx. So let me ask you this.
I would say little.
All right, maybe not so little anymore.
Okay.
I did want to ask you this, and it's a little off topic. What did you think then when Jimmy Carter came out with his book on Israel as an apartheid state?
Well, I think as you become more sensitized globally to these issues, you look for parallels. Obviously, there aren't exact parallels. Each country has their own history, their own dynamic, and what have you. You can't compare them. But there has been a disturbing increase of sort of separation, the separation wall in Israel, the attitude of contempt that's shown by many Israelis towards many Palestinians, kind of racist attitudes, invites the comparison with South Africa. And there are many people now in this BDS, boycott and disinvest movement, who are using the tactics of the anti-apartheid movement to challenge Israel. So while the parallels aren't necessarily exact, some of the realities look disturbingly, alike. And it's not me saying this. I mean, people like Archbishop Tutu traveled to Israel, and spoke out against this. And many people, including Mandela, called on Israel to make changes in their policies, which they haven't made. You'll notice that of 92 heads of state who went to South Africa to honor Mandela after he died, Netanyahu was conspicuous by his absence, and his explanation was, well, we couldn't afford the trip, okay?
Yeah, right. He can't afford the trip. Come on.
Right. So obviously there's parallels here, and there's things. There is in South Africa a big movement about this, which really upsets the Israelis a great deal, and of course, this is an issue where we've seen very little progress. I mean, if negotiations could take place in South Africa after 350 years of history of colonialism, of 40 years of apartheid, certainly they could take place in Israel, okay?
Right.
And except people there don't want negotiations, okay? And and want to characterize people who want negotiations, who want diplomacy, who want nonviolent solutions as anti-Semitic, which, is to me laughable to be called anti-Semitic when I am Semitic, okay?
Right, exactly.
So I have a real problem with that, and it's very disturbing, to feel this kind of, shall we say, self-righteous arrogance, okay? The sense of victimization. In other words, look what happened to us. Never again. We'll never allow this. But never like, hey, it didn't just happen to us. What about the Catholic priests that were killed? What about the gays that were killed during the Holocaust? What about the gypsies that were killed? Well, this is a human rights violation that was universal and should be condemned. Obviously, what the Nazis did, but it's not the special property of people who say, well, this is our, issue, as if, we're the only ones in the world who suffered. I'm sorry, not true. And,
right.
What we need to show is more compassion, if you will, and more understanding of universal principles of human rights, not a narrow sectarian, special. We are the, special people, and nobody else has suffered. Well, not true.
Right. Well, I got to tell you, Danny, your response to that makes me proud to be a New Yorker.
Thank you so much.
Because we all grew up, you're in pretty much the same age group I am. And we grew up so differently than the rest of the country. And I'm so grateful to have grown up in New York, and unlike you, I didn't go to Dewey. I went to Jefferson High School. I was in East New York where, boy, you talk about black and white. That was black and white. I haven't seen the movie yet, Long Walk Home.
You better hurry up because it's Long Walk to Freedom, but it's...
Oh, I'm sorry, Long Walk to Freedom.
And by the way, the most recent thing I've written is, a protest to the Oscar people, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, for not honoring this film, okay? And that's because we would prefer to honor a film which has victimization and suffering like 12 Years a Slave, but not liberation and struggle, which is the South African film. In other words, as a topic, that topic is not somehow that Hollywood rallies behind. And I feel it's a diss to the movie. And the fact that they garnered one song by Bono about love with an Oscar nomination and nothing in the movie is really a shrewd, cynical gesture, because now U2 is going to be playing at the Oscar ceremony. So that was the idea, to get them there, to build the ratings of the TV broadcast, but not to honor this movie. And I think this was wrong. 92 countries in the world saluted Mandela, but Hollywood, as they say in Hollywood, passed. Okay? Mm-hmm. And I find that very objectionable.
Well, that's all political garbage anyway. Maybe if Oprah was in it, it would have been a bigger hit. But before I started,
I hope didn't get honored.
Before I started reading your book, I had watched the movie Winnie with Jennifer Hudson, where she played Winnie Mandela. And when I posted on Facebook that I thought the movie was great, man, the hatred that poured out towards Winnie Mandela was shocking to me.
Well, I think Long Walk to Freedom is much more balanced about Winnie. Winnie endorsed that movie. She didn't endorse the other film because, they took her story without her permission, basically, is from what I understand.
Yeah, but everybody was like, why are you cheering for her? She was a murderer. I mean, crazy stuff.
But of course, she, had a very hard time also, and the details of that are actually explored in this movie. Naomi Harris, who was in the last James Bond movie, plays Winnie beautifully. She's an amazing actor, and I recommend that you see it and that your audience sees it, before they speak. Mao Zedong said, if I can quote the great helmsman here, no investigation, no right to speak. If you haven't really investigated, shut up.
Absolutely. Danny, we're going to take a short break, but when we get back, let's touch on some of the different sides of Nelson Mandela. And,
how am I doing?
You're doing great. So just hold on, and Danny and I will be right back.
Wow. One solid hour of commercial-free information thanks to you. The person who wants truth has the integrity and understanding to support it with your donation and subscription. Meria believes people can handle the truth and delivers it tirelessly with those with ears to listen. 14 years on the net. Won't you take a moment right now to commit to a subscription of your choice at www.meria.net. That's MERIA.net. Over 1,100 hours of pure education all in one place, 24/7 and all downloadable. Knowledge is power. Sharing that knowledge is wisdom. Together we can change the world and create real hope. Now let's get back to the Meria Heller Show.
Okay, welcome back. I'm speaking with Danny Schechter. We're talking about his latest book on Nelson Mandela, Madiba, and A to Z, the many faces of Nelson Mandela. Danny, during the break you were telling me that you host a show on PRN, Gary Knowles Network.
Yeah, I do indeed. It's Thursdays at 5. I'm not going to be on this week or next week, but I do have been doing programs there for the last year plus, and keeping a finger in radio. I spent 10 years at WBCN in Boston, the big rock station of the main rock station in the nation, really, Radio Free Boston. And as a consequence, radio is close to my heart, and I was happy when I was asked to respond and try to do this program. It's one of the things that I do. I also do a blog every day at newsdissector.net, about 2,000 words, trying to comment on the news, and I'm also an editor of MediaChannel.org, which is a website that tries to monitor the media. So,
You're a busy guy.
I'm, kind of doing a lot of multimedia stuff right now.
Well, I can then guess that you probably like that song "Smoke on the Water." Being an old Boston kid.
It's. I think because as the media, in my view, gets worse, not better, even though there's so much more of it now than there was when I grew up, I find people are often as ready to, buy what is being sold to them, not only as products, but as messages, as ever. We saw that I did a film called WMD, Weapons of Mass Deception, about the role that television coverage played in promoting the war in Vietnam. The war in Iraq. They promoted the war in Vietnam too, but the war in Iraq. And so in a sense, it's we still have this deceptive media, and we still have a lot of activists who don't see media as important. They think because there's Twitter and Facebook, it's all a free media. They don't realize that, that their information is being sold to the highest bidder, that the NSA is using these companies and is in collusion with these companies spying on all of us. So there's a subtext to all of this. I'm just writing sort of my story about South Africa, my involvement there, and the media projects that I worked on, trying to get this story out in America and the difficulties that we had. And it's not done yet, but maybe in the next few months it'll come out. And in the course of it, just realizing how little has changed, really, in terms of the attitudes of the big decision makers in the media. And I had the opportunity, if you will, the experience of being on the inside at CNN, ABC News, CNBC. I worked for these companies, so I could watch exactly how things went down and how stories were sanitized, censored, and suppressed. So, this is not surprising to me, but it is part of what I care about and try to work on and write about. And,
I think the U.S. Today, in a recent report, said that we're like 46th in free press in the world. 46th, and we claim to be, Republican democracy. Let's get back to Nelson Mandela.
Can you imagine?
No, it's embarrassing.
It was shocking. Some breaking news. A water faucet in Sochi didn't work, and a tourist couldn't get a glass of water. How shocking!
Okay. Right, but
it's incidents like that get elevated, into the discourse repeatedly and the larger narrative of what this is all about and what's going on in the Ukraine with the United States and Russia and all this, none of this is being discussed. So, we're still in an era of missing information. So people, watch the news, but they don't know the background to the news, okay?
Right. They only know what they're told to know.
Partially, yeah, I think that's true. Although there is also the growth of a lot more media savvy people who have recognized that the lamestream media, as it's called, is useless, and have chosen other options. And I think they look for more diverse information on websites and the like.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I first started doing my show, I just thought I'd do it for fun for a couple of months, and somebody else would pick up the slack, but that never happened, and here I am 14 years later. So, those are the kind of things that I discuss, like the conversation you and I are having. This conversation's not going to happen on ABC.
Yeah, you noticed that, huh?
Yeah, I don't think that.
I noticed it too, and I tried to make it happen, and in some instances I did get to make it happen, but it was a very disturbing exposure to how news is turned into a product, and there's been a merger of, not just on the corporate level, but of news biz and showbiz.
Right, has to be
showbiz values.
Right.
And you see this throughout the media. Why do you think, many people think Jon Stewart is the best news person there is?
Wow.
Okay, and he probably is.
You can barely argue with that, though.
Yeah, but, he's promoting, not selling, not information, but attitude, okay?
Right.
Aren't these people ridiculous? Isn't that stupid? Isn't that a joke? So it's all about making fun, not changing the media, okay? Mm-hmm. And he does a great job of it. I'm not knocking him.
Absolutely.
I'm not knocking him, but that approach is become a dominant approach,
Right. It almost seems
many
like
media outlets make fun of themselves, you know what I mean?
It almost seems like Americans are just too stupid to want to hear their news any other way than as jokes.
I don't know if you've been reading all this stuff, Maria, about how the whole middle class in America is collapsing, and people, are not shopping in stores because they don't have any money.
Right.
People are basically going through a process of what we call downward mobility.
Right.
Kids are going to college saddled with so much debt that they'll never get out from under the yoke of all that debt. In other words, there are reasons for why this has happened. One of the things with the Mandela film was, I think the distributor assumed that the black community would come out and support this movie.
Right.
Why? Mandela is black, and they're black. Therefore, it's kind of simplistic things like that. Well, Mandela was actually fighting for a non-racial South Africa, not for a black South Africa, okay?
Right.
And on top of it, the black community has been devastated with all these subprime loans, so foreclosures, no jobs, no job creation, et cetera, and so forth. So we hear like the unemployment rate is going down. It's at 6.6. Nobody talks about the youth unemployment rate, which is at 15.9, and that understates it, okay?
Right, well, nobody's talking about how many black Americans are rotting in prison either, the inequality there.
Well, you're absolutely right. But what I'm getting at is there are reasons for why, for people who are living on desperation row, so to speak, are struggling. Now that they've cut $6 billion in food stamps, it's going to hurt people even more.
Right.
And they're going to go to a movie where it costs $14 to go in.
I know, it's impossible.
And then if you go with a family, the popcorn is $8. By the time you get out of there, whatever you made that week is gone, okay?
I know. So, going to a movie is like it used to be to go to the theater.
So what I'm saying is this is a change of the economy of all of this, and people don't fully recognize it. So everybody has cell phones, and then they get these gigantic bills because they're sitting there all day long, checking their messages, checking this, checking that. You see what I mean?
Yes, I do. It's really, really sad. I did want to get back, and let's get back to Nelson Mandela for a while. One thing I was really I don't know, I had to read it twice because I never knew this. but I did not know that there are 3 classifications in South Africa: white, black, and colored. Because when I was a kid in America, black people were called colored people. But I didn't know that they had 3 distinctions in South Africa.
Well, it was a very racially conscious society. The colored designation came from the people who were kind of Malays who came to the Cape region of South Africa in the 1600s under the Dutch, and they intermarried. They spoke Afrikaans language, but they intermarried. And so while they weren't black, they weren't white. So they were given this distinction of being colors. And then, of course, there was a lot of tests that were done to test somebody's racial purity. You know, like, for example, could you put a pencil in your hair? If you could, you were black, okay, and it would stay there, all right? So, and then there was also Indians. People came from India as indentured, servants, indentured workers to pick the sugar cane. And that's where Gandhi got started in South Africa, campaigning for human rights. So it's a complex society, 11 official languages, lots of different tribes and whatnot. So the idea that these people were able to achieve a level of unity and work together is quite remarkable, given the fact that it's so hard in America to get people to get together and to work together, okay?
Right, exactly.
So this is one of the achievements of the ANC in South Africa, however much it may have lost its way or lost its distinction, become corrupt, whatever. It was a popular movement that championed all the people, not just a few, and it wasn't racially oriented only because it had alliances with communists, with liberals, with other peoples. So, this is the difference in terms of the movement. That's what also interested me in it, because I was saying, like, how do we win? Here we had the civil rights movement. We had the support from so many people. We were fighting March on Washington, 1963, all the rest of it. And then what began to happen was separation, black, black power, blacks for blacks, Latinos for Latinos. The idea of working together with other people for common goals began to erode, okay, partly out of frustration because there was, I'm sure, racial prejudices within the movement and the like. But, it also showed the way in which our society was pulling apart, and it still is to some degree. So it's hard to build a movement. We had Occupy Wall Street in New York, but they were anti-leader. They didn't want any leaders. They didn't want any structure, okay? And that's so it's a very anarchist set of principles, but in the end it disappeared.
Right.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me? Where do you think the movement's going to go now that Mandela is dead? And your book clearly makes it pretty clear to me that the young people in South Africa are not really that interested anymore in their history.
Well, partly they haven't been. It's like, are you interested in something? Not necessarily until somebody interests you in it, okay?
Right.
If it's not, and makes it interesting, okay? Mm-hmm. This is the problem when we conclude so-and-so's not interested, and the only thing they've been exposed to is something that's not interesting or oriented towards trying to engage them. It's not surprising they turn off and tune out. Okay, why do they tune into rap and all these other things? It's more exciting, it's more dynamic, etc. And this is one of the problems the South Africans assumed, because they had won. They didn't have to, teach their own history to their people. Okay, and as a consequence, a lot of programming, began to be replaced in South Africa by, Oprah-style programming, American, etc. and so forth. And the consequence is that it demeans the whole culture. So South Africans, also grew out of a society that had been targeted by sanctions, was, far away from everywhere else, had their own culture. The old government reinforced sports, rugby, cricket, and soccer, to football to some degree, and so they try to depoliticize the culture. A lot of when the ANC came to power finally, there was most of the white South Africans. Most of them didn't even know what they were. They just thought they were terrorists because that's what they had been told over and over and over again.
Right.
And Mandela was on the American terrorist list, believe it or not, until 2008.
Which is crazy.
After he had already left office, he had been the president of the country and was being still considered by the United States a terrorist. So, our country also does the same thing. It's hard to learn our real history. And, with cutbacks in schools, the move towards charter schools, the focus on science and math skills and the rest of it, whole generations are growing up that don't even know the history, wouldn't even be able to follow what we've been talking about on this program. They have no concept of it, okay?
Right.
And so the challenge here is how do you popularize these issues? How do you make it, if you care, how do you try to encourage others to care? And this is the challenge, that we all have.
Well, hopefully the movie will help.
How do we, bring our values and our histories onto other generations?
Exactly, especially since they're all talking in, little monosyllables to each other and destroying what little is left of the English language. Danny, some people say that Mandela was a bully and a communist.
Well, he denied being a communist, for one thing, okay? Mm-hmm. He denied a member of the Communist Party. There are other people who claim that because he was at a certain meeting or he was simply, he was in an alliance. They had an alliance with communists. The reason communists were popular in South Africa in part was because it was a non-racial party. So blacks who didn't want to, or Indians or coloreds or others who didn't want to be just classified politically by their racial interests, would join the Communist Party because the Communist Party appealed across racial and class lines, okay? Mm-hmm. So that was one reason for its popularity. And, and since it was denigrated by the apartheid system, and because the ANC started to be called communist as well, they decided to make an alliance with the Communist Party, which they did, and still have, okay, and the labor unions. So there is a debate over whether or not he was or was not in the Communist Party. Personally, I don't think he was. I think his main allegiance was with the ANC, which he repeated many, many times. And the foundation that has the archives of all of his work says, why can't we accept what Mandela said himself, which is that he wasn't in the Communist Party. But, it wasn't that he was against them. He had his own set of priorities. He was, and that's what the victory that they had in South Africa was not a communist victory. They didn't create a communist economy. And in fact, the head of the Communist Party, Joe Slovo, who was also in the ANC, was one of the leaders in working out compromises with the Afrikaners. So I think this whole communist label is being used to try to discredit him and the ANC, as it was during the Cold War period, when, of course, the United States government officially would not allow members of the ANC to come to America because of the McCarran anti-communist acts. As for him being a bully, as a young man, he was very brash. Okay, he was a spider. He was, he didn't want to, he was part of a youth league that was challenging the older leadership of the ANC. And, he acted in a way that was often perceived as being a bully. And I go into that. By the end, he said that in prison he matured his understanding about how to work with people who he didn't agree with or he wasn't on the same page with. And so he evolved. He didn't remain this antagonistic person. In fact, many of you see in the movie Long Walk to Freedom, when the young generation, the next generation, the generation of the Soweto uprising comes into the prison. They're captured. They're brought into the prison. They're angry young men. They're hostile. They're hostile to Mandela and all the rest of it. So, it's a kind of a replay of stuff that happened, in our country, okay, where, some of the Black Panther movements and whatnot were perceived as hostile to the older civil rights movements.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'm sure you know that his children currently are fighting over his estate. What do you think about that?
Well, right now, apparently they've announced his will, and he, in the course of being out of prison, he acquired various ways 3 houses, which is what had all the value. Just like, my apartment was worth X when I moved in here in 1981. Now it's worth Y. Okay.
Right.
Suddenly, it's worth all this money because real estate values have gone up, not because of anything I've done, okay?
Right.
So, partly that was the benefit. He wrote a book. He had royalties. He did artwork. He sold those artworks. He had some money. So he created a trust for not just his children, but for his grandchildren. And this issue has been debated a lot. There was a feeling on the part of some of his kids that other people were going to benefit, and they were not. That they were being cut out somehow. Right. And as far as I know, there's the will. Nobody challenged it, as far as I know. And the trusts that he also set up have not been really publicly revealed. I think the family sort of came together and resolved a lot of their differences.
Oh, that's a good thing.
Look what's happening in the Martin Luther King family.
Oh, yeah, they're all off the charts. I know, they're all psycho.
You have a big name, and you have a burden, the Heller name, you know what I mean?
Right.
People hear that, they figure you're very wealthy,
Yeah.
So,
right, they'd be figuring wrong for me.
This is something that seems to come with the territory of the next generation feeling like, everybody else is benefiting but us, and
right.
And a lot of these people who supported my father were hypocrites or didn't really support him, et cetera, and so forth.
Well, I think that happens in a lot of families.
I can't get into that. I'm not
making Danny, we only have 2 minutes left because Gary knows. Gary's time cutoff. But the last 2 minutes, I wanted to ask you, what do you think?
Gary's what? I missed what you said.
I said Gary's time cutoff for his show is 55 minutes. What did you think of the way they presented Mandela in death? His funeral and what's been said afterwards. Do you think it was a lot of fluff?
I think he was presented, unfortunately, as an icon, as a one-dimensional personality, as a great hero and celebrity. He got the Madonna treatment. I don't think that's appropriate. There was also a meeting here in New York of the UN General Assembly where all these different nations gave very moving tributes to him and when he visited them and all the rest of it. This was not reported on at all. So obviously if people's kind of image is being reinforced, but they're not learning more. That's why I wrote this book, Madiba A to Z, to try to share more knowledge about Mandela, who's an extraordinary figure, of our time, of our century, and to try to share that. And fortunately, the book is getting some attention. It is getting read, but of course, no review in the New York Times, no review in the Washington Post, not being necessarily being taken seriously by the mainstream. But guess what? I'm not surprised.
No, of course not. When you have 4 corporations that own it all.
We have a website, MadibaBook.com. MadibaBook.com. You can read more about it. There's some interviews with me on Real News Network out today, trnn.com, and there's a 3-part series of interviews with me that your audience might be interested in.
That's great, and there's a live link here. Of course, just click through, buy the book. You're going to learn more about Nelson Mandela than you've ever known before. Danny, thank you so much for joining me today, and I promise it won't be 12 years before I get you back.
My pleasure. Do you think I'll get Show of the Week? I don't know. I hope.
I think so. I think you earned it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
My pleasure, Danny. Take care. Bye. Danny Schechter, News Dissector. And you know what? Everything you want to know about Nelson Mandela is in this book. I love the way he wrote it. Easy reading. You're going to learn the good, the bad, the ugly. And the bottom line is the man never said he was a saint any more than I ever tell people. Please don't worship me. I'm no saint. But he was a man who changed the world. Make no mistake about it. Anyway, I'll see you guys tomorrow when I'm back with the news. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening and supporting The Meria Show. Tell others what you learned today. Knowledge becomes wisdom only when it's shared. Encourage others to subscribe today. www.meria.net. Often imitated, never duplicated. A world of information all in one place. www.meria.net. Always ahead of the curve. Always on your side. Get active or get radioactive. Subscribe today.